Today I'm in Ecclesall Woods, and this is the largest ancient woodland in South Yorkshire, and I know I'm in an ancient woodland because I'm surrounded by bluebells in all directions. And bluebells are what are described as an ancient woodland indicator species, so they're one of the key species that you would expect to find here, and Ecclesall Woods is particularly well known for its bluebells. And the definition of an ancient woodland is a woodland that's been on a map since 1600, or another definition that I like to use is it's about the ecological quality of the woodland and it's about the soil itself. So the seed bank contains a lot of complexity. It contains many different life forms, many different plants, and those seeds can remain dormant in the soil for a very long time, many decades at a time, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. So bluebells, in common with many woodland species, actually do like a fair bit of sun. So we're in a relatively sunny spot here, because where it's too shady and there's a lot of dense tree cover, you tend to find the bluebells are a lot lower in number, particularly under things like holly, which we do have a bit of a problem with in Ecclesall Woods. There's a lot of holly, and where there's a lot of holly there's less bluebells. In any ancient woodland in the UK, I would expect to find English bluebell. So this is Hyacinthioides non-scripta, and it can be easily told apart from the other bluebell, which is common to people's gardens, which is Hyacinthioides hispanica, or the Spanish bluebell, because it has a nodding form. This is one of the main characteristics. So the stem itself gets to the top where the flowers are, and then it always nods over. It very rarely doesn't do this, except when you can see them just coming into flower, you'll see they go straight up, but as soon as they start to produce the bell shape, the nodding form is very obvious. So the bells are also quite narrow. And if you were to compare this side by side with the Spanish bluebell, you'd really see that the Spanish bluebell has this very wide trumpet, whereas this is a very narrow form. And the other thing that gives it away is the colour. So these tend to be a much more deep violet colour, whereas the Spanish bluebells are often a little bit paler, and sometimes they're also white, the Spanish bluebells. But it's not to say that you can't get white English bluebells, because you will find the occasional white form in this woodland, and they're just a variation, a natural variation. The other thing that's significant here is the shape of the leaves, and this can be really important because unfortunately English bluebells actually hybridise with the Spanish form, and it gets harder to tell them apart just from the flower by themselves. So you can actually look at the leaves to actually check for sure. So a Spanish bluebell has a very broad leaf, and they're a little bit more rigid than this as well, whereas an English bluebell will always have this narrow leaf, and it's slightly less stiff as well. They're a little bit more floppy, much like the top of the flower themselves. The plant we're looking at here, although locally quite common in the wood, it's so small that you tend to walk straight past it. This is wood sorrel, or Oxalis acetosella, and it's got a very distinctive leaf, a trifoliate leaf, just like clover, so it's readily identified by that. But at this time of year it's also got these delightful little white flowers which tell you exactly what it is. Now you don't tend to see it very frequently because it's very easily trampled, and obviously this is a very busy wood in Ecclesall Woods, so they tend to only exist where they can grow away from the edge of the path. So you often find them on the bases of trees like this, so this is growing on the edge of an oak, base of an oak, or you find them on banks that are slightly less trampled. So a lovely plant, and also, well worth noting, in common with all the sorrel type plants, you can actually eat the leaves, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's such a small plant that it would be a bit irresponsible to harvest it. I'm looking at a beech tree here. This is Fagus sylvatica, and it can be easily recognised by its very smooth bark, or for a tree it's got smooth bark anyway. At this stage, this is not a particularly old tree. They get much larger than this and much wider. That's one of their other characteristics. They tend to be a very dominant tree. They really take over the space they're in. But if we look at the bark, you see it's grey, and although it does have a texture on it, it remains broadly like this as it ages, whereas many trees get craggier with age, whereas what tends to happen with beech is it tends to become just more covered in green algae as time goes on, so they might look less grey and more green. Now the other thing is, if we look at the leaves, this is unusually large for a beech leaf actually, so they're often quite a bit smaller than this, maybe 2/3 or even half the size, especially as these are new leaves that have only been out for maybe a couple of weeks or so. So it's not the size that's significant here, it's the shape. So they are a perfect symmetrical shape. They also have an undulating leaf margin. So if you can see that, that's what I would describe as an undulation. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. And if you look very, very closely, you might just be able to see they've got a slightly hairy edge to them as well. So the thing about beech leaves is they are this fantastic acidic green colour, so they're really easy to pick out in the landscape. And particularly when you see them growing next to bluebells, it's the colour combination, the colour contrast between them is absolutely stunning. The other thing about beech leaves, they are edible. So along with the nuts, which are produced later in the year, you can eat these. And they're slightly like a sort of a slightly zingy lettuce flavour. So they're quite edible, but I wouldn't want to eat too many because tree leaves do have tannin in. This hasn't got the most tannin of any tree, not like an oak tree, but you can certainly eat a few of these and they're actually quite good for you. This is a hornbeam and it looks superficially slightly similar to a beech tree, only you'll notice that it's got this incredibly serpentine wiggly trunk. Now this is a particularly good example of its form. Not all hornbeams are quite as wiggly as this, but that's what really distinguishes them from beech, because beech are a very erect tree. They go straight up and form these very broad canopies, whereas the hornbeam, which is Carpinus speculus, will actually produce a crown much lower down, and you can see there's almost like this layering effect of the branches going up the tree. So that really does help to distinguish it from beech. The other thing it has in common with beech is it actually doesn't really belong in this woodland. So both beech and hornbeam were introduced from the south of England, where they are native, and they were planted in Ecclesall Woods probably around about a couple of 100 years ago. It's not to say that this tree is that old, but it's probably getting on for that. At least, you know, I would imagine this tree is well over 100 years old. Now if we look at the leaves here, what the easiest way of telling the leaf apart from beech, so the things it shares in common actually are it's got a very symmetrical form, but it has a much stronger point on the leaf than a beech does. And also if you look at the edge, although it does have a slightly undulating edge to it, it's actually got a serration, so like a knife serration on the edge of the leaf, and that's what it gives it away, because the beech leaf definitely doesn't have that. So it's longer and it has that distinctive slightly toothed serrated edge to it. The other thing which is fascinating about this tree is the bark. So if you look at the bark, there's a texture that runs down, or a pattern that runs down the tree. And the North Americans call this, the common name for it, they call it musselwood. And you can really see it in the tree, so it's like striated mussel. So if you really take that name on board, it really helps you identify the tree. The other thing that it tends to resemble is sometimes it looks like a lot of water's just dripped down the tree. So it has this very characteristic pattern which you just don't see on beech trees. This is another of the tree species that's been introduced into Ecclesall Woods. This is sweet chestnut, Castanea sativa, and it's not even local or indigenous to the UK. It's actually from southern Europe, and it was introduced into the woods as a fast-growing alternative to oak for its timber value. But if I look at the leaf, what tells me it's a sweet chestnut? It's not the size, because at this moment in time they're actually very small because they're obviously recently emerged. Eventually these could be up to 20 centimetres long, each of these leaves. But what tells me it's a sweet chestnut is the toothed margin, and I would describe that as like a sawtooth, so it goes up and down quite distinctly. And as the leaf matures, you can see that pattern remains and gets more distinct. So this helps me distinguish it from the many other leaves in the woodlands that are actually also very symmetrical and have a slightly pointed tip. Now, this is generally formed as a very large tree. This is not a particularly good specimen for that, so we can't really read the bark off this tree, but as the tree becomes very mature, it has a very distinctive bark, quite twisted. But the large trees in this woodland, for which Ecclesall Woods is rightfully known, produce an abundance of sweet chestnuts, so I'll be back here in October to be foraging those. This lovely little white flower is the greatest stitchwort, otherwise known as Stellarium holostea, And the name Stellarium refers to its star-like shaped flower, so that's what you're looking for, something that's really star-like. This one's a particularly good example. So they have slightly variable form to it, but typically the petals themselves have this kind of indent on it, quite a deep indent, so it almost looks like 10 petals, but actually it's 5 paired petals. So much like the bluebell that it's growing next to, you often find them growing in conjunction with each other because they like the same conditions, quite a lot of light. They are both ancient woodland indicator species, so if you see them growing together, it's a strong sign they're actually in an ancient woodland. You'll notice as well we've got some bramble here, and you'd think that it might actually struggle to grow with bramble because bramble's a bit of a fug and it will grow quite tall, often 4 foot, 5 foot high in places. But I've seen Stellaria actually get to the top of the pile, so it will, even though it's got very spindly stems, it will actually grow through the bramble so that it can find the light, because like bluebell it does need light in order to be able to flower well.